In this tutorial, we're going to look at the perspective tool and different ways we could play around with perspective that normally without this tool, it'd be kind of a little tricky to play with perspective in Illustrator. So we're just going to start off with this. Number one, this perspective tool here. To make sure we have access to the perspective tool, we're going to go to Window, and we're going to make sure that our toolbar is set to Advanced, not Basic, and then we're going to have access to the perspective tool. So there are two more or less tools that we're going to look at, Perspective Grid Tool and Perspective Selection Tool. So I'm just going to click on the Perspective Grid Tool, and what I get right away is I'm going to get, when I click on it, if I just got rid of, there we go, and there's my perspective grid. Now it's a 2-point grid that by default it gives you. And it also gives me this little widget at the top that's very important too. Sometimes it just shows up when you click on this accidentally and people don't know how to get rid of it. Mainly, just right off the bat, just to make sure we understand, you have to have a perspective tool selected in order for you to click on the X and get rid of it. All right, so if I want to bring it back, I can just click on the perspective tool and it brings it back for me. So right now I want to bring it down to this artboard. So I want to move this grid down here, very easy. I'm just going to select this bottom diamond shape, I'm going to call it for now, and I'm just going to bring it down, and now everything I have is going to be in perspective down here. So this is great. So what I want to do, I want to start playing around with perspective. So I am going to use this widget to help me do that. So what I could do, I'm going to click on, as we can see, our blue left side face is selected. If I click on this one, the orange right side face is selected. And if I click on the bottom, the green bottom face is selected. And I could also click on the back. It turns into like a light baby blue. That would suggest I'm going to work on the back or not on the perspective. So I'm going to start with the blue as it is by default, and that's all I'm going to do is I'm going to select a tool. I'm going to select my shape tool, select the rectangle, and anything I do right now will be in this side of perspective. Only this side blue, because that's what I have selected. So I'm going to start drawing something. I'm just going to make it very simple just to have us understood that see how no matter what I do, this shape will stay in perspective. I'm just going to line it up to the cube I have right there. And there's my shape. I could change the color of it. I could do whatever I want. Let me just give it a quick color. There it is. Okay. Now that is using that side on the widget. If I change that, and I'm still on my perspective tool, I click on the other side. Now the orange side, as you can see, the orange grid, I can once again take any shape. I'll take the ellipse this time, and I'll just size it up. I'll hold down Option, and that is how we use the any shape, quite frankly. The ellipse tool works here, but we could actually make it fit inside just like this, and it will stay in perspective quite nicely, okay? So that is how we keep things in perspective. Now here's something interesting. Say the circle's off a little bit. I want it to be inside the cube. Well, what could I do? What I would normally do is select my black arrow or white arrow and just click it and move it. Well, notice something. It's no longer in perspective. It's not moving in perspective. So what that does is using the black or white arrow will actually remove it from perspective. Yes, the ellipse itself is in a perspective right now, but once I choose a black or white arrow, it will remove it from perspective. But I don't want that. I want to keep it in perspective. So that's where this other tool comes in handy. Right click on Perspective Grid Tool and click Perspective Selection Tool. And now what happens? I get to keep it in perspective. So that's how we actually keep certain things in perspective. I can size it up. I can do whatever I want. I could transform it in perspective that I have currently selected. Okay, so that's an interesting one there too. I'm just going to change the color of just to make sure. And now the last one I'm going to do is I'm going to do the bottom face see, once again, it did not work because I have my black arrow selected. I have to make sure that one of my perspective tools is selected. Select the bottom face, and now I can go to another shape here. Let me just grab the polygon because it doesn't really matter, and I'm just going to click and drag, and now whatever I have is in perspective on that green layer there. Maybe this wasn't the best tool to choose. It's okay. I'll go back here and I'll just make this one work this way. There we go. So there I have my bottom face showing. And once again, it shows just like arranging properly. The bottom part was the last thing I just did, so therefore it's on top of everything, which is totally fine. I'll just change the color of that just to make sure. There we go. Okay, and if I want, of course, I could click on that, send it to back, and it's behind everything, just to make sense of kind of what I'm looking at here. But once again, if I click on the black arrow or white arrow and I move it around, it's no longer in perspective. If I click on the perspective selection tool, I can move it and it will stay in that bottom green perspective, okay? So now there are a few different ways to play around with the perspective tool in general. There is, under view, a perspective grid. Hide grid, yes, you could hide it, but we also know how to hide it now using our perspective tools, and we could hide the grid. And we could always bring it back as well. And there we are. I can go back, perspective grid. I can show rulers. So if there's rulers, measurements you want to keep, you could show rulers. You can change the measurements, I'm sure, by going to your Illustrator preferences, or if you're on a PC, edit preferences and change your ruler type. Right now, I'm just going to go back into view in the perspective grid. My computer's going a little slow right now. And I'm able to show a few different things. What I have is a 1-point perspective I can look at, which by default is not. It's on 2-point perspective. There's a 1-point perspective, a 2-point, and a 3-point perspective that you could look at. But once again, by default, it's 2-point. I'm not going to go into it, but you're able to play around with those too. You could lock your grid. You could snap to grid. You could save a certain grid as a preset. That's totally fine. So you get a few other options here as well. The last thing I want to show you is playing around with type, which would still be the same as playing around with any shape, but type is kind of interesting how we've done it up here and we kept it in perspective. So instead of doing and going to my black or white arrow tool, I'm just going to click on perspective tool, perspective selection, and then click on the background, because now nothing is going to be in perspective. I'm just going to type, and I'll just type hello. And that, obviously you can see, is not in perspective. Nothing is selected, that's fine. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to select my perspective selection tool. I'm going to click on one of the faces here, and I'm just going to click and drag and watch what happens. Now all of a sudden that word is going to be in perspective. I can size it up a certain way, holding down shift to keep it in proportion. And now I just took that piece of type that was not in perspective at all, even though my perspective tool was still selected. I typed something out and I was able to move it to a perspective just by clicking on one of the faces and doing it. I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to click on the background. Actually, I'm going to do it one more time in a slightly different way. I'm going to click off and make sure this is gone. For now, my perspective is gone. The perspective tool is no longer on at the moment. I'm just going to type something out normally, just as I was, and this time I'll say goodbye because the video is almost over. Okay, I'm going to select it. That's fine. I'm going to move it around. Obviously, nothing happens. This time, I'm going to click on the perspective tool. I'm going to bring back the grid one more time. Click on perspective tool. Click on it. And once again, I'm going to click on maybe this side now. Now, what I can do, I can move it around, and it's going to stay in perspective. And with that tool still selected, I could size it up, size it down, keep it in line, keep it in proportion, and play around with it there. So there's many different ways to play around with the perspective tool, but the greatest thing is it would be very difficult to do this without the perspective tool. To keep something in perspective and play around with the horizon, that would be pretty tricky to do. So now one last thing I do want to go through is playing around with the grid tool. So what I can do with this grid is I can move the horizon line around. I can obviously play around with the horizon where I want that to be. If I want it to be a little bit lower, a little higher. Sorry, playing with this isn't playing with the horizon. It's playing on the horizon, but it's moving the different faces, whichever one I want. This doesn't interfere with that. It just lets me move whatever I want when I want to. And the up and down as well, how tall I want that perspective or not. Now another one here, obviously clicking on these will help you move it around, which is fine. Another one here is actually moving these around too to get a specific way you want your perspective to move. But look at this. Instead of having it look like a grid, I could have it look a few different ways. By holding down Option, I can click on it and it actually changes it to a full face of that color, still blue. I can hold down Option again and click on it, and then it disappears. Although it disappears, it's not there, it's still there, and I can keep things in perspective, but maybe I want it to be a little bit cleaner. I don't want to see all that grid. It's hard, it distracts a little bit. That's not a problem. So what I could do, I click on it one more time, holding down Option, I bring it back, and now I'm back to the grid again. So that goes with all of my faces, all three of my faces. I can do that, and I could kind of clean it up a little bit, or I could just keep it as a face if I wanted to, all of them as a face, and that would work out well too. That would help me out. Either way you want to do that, doesn't matter. So that's how we play around with the grid. Once again, to get rid of it, you just click on a perspective tool, click on the perspective, or of course view perspective grid and hide or show the grid or hide the grid. And you can get familiar with the keyboard shortcut for that as well. And that is the perspective grid.